maybe you can share about your faith and your spirituality that has influenced your want and your desire to be building peace.
Well, when you ask me the question that way, I mean, my passion for peace goes all the way back to my childhood, and I grew up as in the Old Order German Baptist Church. I still feel myself as a part of the Old Order German Baptists, although I have pursued my life in such a way that I'm really not a part of that right now. But I remember so well listening to the scriptures being interpreted, that Jesus is a peacemaker, and that's our calling, all of us, to be peacemakers as Jesus was. And that so touched me that I've always felt that is all of our calling, to be peacemakers, like Jesus was a peacemaker. And I grew up with that. I realized as I went to college and university and in different places that was true. I then had to decide whether I was going to be a conscientious objector when I was drafted, and I decided to be a conscientious objector, although my teachers at graduate school said, "How foolish you are." I said, "That's what I believe, that's what I'm going to do." I spent 2 years in Brethren Volunteer Service and came back, and I've been teaching Christian ethics at the seminary, and my whole life has been directed that way. So that's how my faith is shaped by and toward peacemaking. But what about you? How has your faith shaped your vision of peacemaking?
Well, I did grow up in the Church of the Brethren, so I feel very blessed to be a part of a tradition that was part of my understanding of Jesus from a very early age, that Jesus was the Prince of Peace. And ironically, I was in 8th grade when we experienced 9/11, so it was right in the very fundamental part of my growing up and growing into a more personalized faith. And it wasn't really till that time that I realized other people outside of the church didn't think of Jesus this way. That when people were aching for a direct response right after 9/11, hearing the voice from my own congregation calling for a different type of response was the first time that I realized that there was anything peculiar about this Jesus that I had come to know compared to other people. And so that was really the first time that I started thinking about the real need of faith and peace to be in conversation with one another. When I was hearing so many other people, sometimes people of faith, not thinking about Jesus' calling for us to be people of peace.
What happened with you? I mean, did your experience in seminary make a difference then, or what's happened? I mean, you're really committed to peacemaking now. I know that from talking to you before. But so what happened? I mean, when you felt challenged that way and you realized that this was a view that many people don't hold.
Yeah, I mean, I had to figure out what that meant. I ended up in college. I had a minor in peace studies, which conveniently at Bridgewater College is in the religion department.
Yes.
So those two things are constantly in conversation with one another. And for me, it was just a reminder that the Church of the Brethren has a really important voice in the ecumenical world, to be calling people to hear the voice of peace that Christ so often shares. So for me, this is part of what's led me into seminary, was this passion for peace and knowing that that's an important part of my faith. And I hope that's something that I'll continue to carry with me when I'm in my ministry and when I've graduated in a few months.
Well, who's most influenced you in this direction?
My family has been very important. Obviously, my church family. Specifically, I've had grandparents who I felt each in their own kind of quiet way taught me about peace. My grandmother is someone that I've always seen as someone that is caring. She has a quiet nature about her that still that calls you into being who you're supposed to be. And to me, that's been a very important voice of peace. I also have my grandfather on the other side of the family that I remember hearing stories of him during his youth, having to make really important decisions during.
Well, probably World War
yeah.
I, would it be? Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah,
Right.
one of them.
Yeah, one of them.
One
of the World Wars.
Yeah, yeah. He ended up in the military, but refused to take up arms and ended up struggling a lot, trying to figure out what that meant.
World War I, because
Maybe.
there wasn't any option for choosing to be a conscientious objector then. I know that's what really led the leaders of the church to say, if there's another war, we have to have some possibilities for being conscientious objectors. It sounds like it was World War I.
Might be.
But what happened then?
Yeah, he ended up having a really important, then almost ministry to his superiors, because he kept refusing to take up arms. And he tells a story that for him to get leave to go home, he had to go and ask permission, and they would always ask a question. And since he refused to pick up a weapon, they would always ask him a question about a gun. So they would, one time he went in and said, "You need to take this apart and clean it and put it back, and then you can get leave." Well, he did it perfectly because he was a hunter. He'd grown up using guns, and so his superior was like, why, you clearly know about guns. And he said, "Well, that's because I hunt animals, but I don't think it's okay to use these against people." And that was a kind of the first step in having that important message being shared from someone.
Oh, so he was really influential. I mean, you've thought of him often. Who else? And your college teacher or seminary?
Yeah. In college, I had William Abshire as a professor, and he was the one that was heading up the peace department. And I had a very influential class called Christian Perspectives on Violence and Peace in college, and that one was one that really put into connection for me looking at Scripture and how even in the Old Testament, when we think about there being so much violence, how much message of peace is throughout the whole entire Old Testament. And then being here at Bethany with Scott Holland, who's been working on the Just Peace movement.
I know, I've been working with him. That's right.
Yeah, so maybe you have some people that have influenced you in your work.
Well, yes. I mean, the two people I think of right away is, first of all, Dan West. I mean, Dan West has had an incredible influence on me. And partly because, well, like your grandfather, he's in my family. He's the first cousin to my father. And so I knew Dan West from the time I was a young child. We visited together in the family, and it was always very clear what his view was about peace. He was principal of the school where I went to school in Trotwood, Ohio. And so Dan West, I've been in seminars with him. I've done peace seminars, and so I've done a lot of things with Dan West, and he had a terrific influence on me in terms of seeing peace as the center of what our church is about, and something that other churches need to know about. Brethren, we have a special calling to do this, because not just because we're brethren, because it's deeply New Testament. It's deeply a witness to Christ. And but then M.R. Ziegler is the next person. When I went to Europe in Brethren Volunteer Service, well, M.R. Ziegler was the person in charge of that program. And I remember the first time we came, he said, when you come here, he said, some of you are going to die here. Not all of you will go home again. So when you come here, you've brought your whole life here. And that's the way you're to live it here. You're to live it with that kind of dedication. And that was really, it really caught me. I remember M.R. said that that when he was he was served for a while I think it was with the Marines on an island off the East Coast where they did training together, and he was to be a kind of chaplain to that. And he said their conversation always went in the direction of the Marine saying, "Well, if you in the church would simply live according to what you believe, you wouldn't even need us." And MR said, "I think it's true. If we did live the way that we understand the New Testament, we wouldn't need the army to work as much." I thought especially of this when I graduated from Harvard with a degree in social ethics. I was invited by the Air Force to be a chaplain in the Air Force bases around the world. And I thought, can I really do this? Isn't that a contribution to what the military purposes are? And I agonized. I got headaches over this because I saw that there were, yes, I mean, it's a wonderful invitation, but it was so difficult. And I finally said, no, I can't do it. And I talked to MR, and he said, "You should have done it. You made the wrong decision." I'm not sure I made the wrong decision, but that's a difficult thing. Sure. I understand all of our people in our churches have that struggle because it's a human struggle. The struggle between what's really effective and what's not, what we should be doing, what it really means to follow Christ. It's not an easy, quickly answered question.
Right.
So these are the people that influence me the most.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm wondering, I mean, you talked about social ethics, and I know you've been working with Just Peace. Maybe you can talk more about how justice and peace are to be related to one another, because we put them together in these words. What does it actually mean when they're connected to one another?
When I was at the university studying social ethics, I had a course in just war, and traced the whole tradition of just war through the history of the West, and you know, I was really impressed with what's done there. But at the same time, I was also equally impressed with how nobody follows the principles of just war. I mean, the just war principles, the way they're developed, are that, first of all, we should be willing to give our whole selves, including service in the military, to protect other Christians. That was the first idea that Augustine had when he proposed the just war theory, that we should be willing to do that, but that we should never kill other Christians. Well, look at that.
Yeah, that's not
For
worked so well.
heaven's sake, we've been almost totally forgotten since it was first proposed about not killing other Christians. And we should not ever kill non-combatants. That always meant women and children, but that went by the wayside almost immediately. And certainly during the medieval period and the Crusades, it was totally lost. And and the idea of not killing citizens who are not engaged in the military action itself, which was a very basic principle, that's totally gone in the 20th century. I mean, we drop bombs that kill everybody, and the whole idea of winning a war is now that you threaten to destroy the whole not only the whole community but big cities and so forth. I mean, so how can one talk about just war? I mean, what can you say about it anyhow? So when I was asked, after I had taught at the seminary for 25 years, and then I was general secretary for 10 years, and as general secretary I became a member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, and And the World Council was set up really to encourage the churches to be against the kind of killing that happened in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
The whole hope was that it would help us not to have that kind of event again. And to some extent, it was successful, because one of the things that happened was the battle against apartheid. Well, the Bishop Tutu said that without the World Council, that would have never happened. And I was at a meeting in South Africa at the time. It was in January of 1994, and they were just ready to vote about the apartheid, and everybody knew how the vote would go. That the current president would be he would not win the election, and that everybody knew that. And one of the leaders of the worship service got up and said, at this great time, this historic event, we need another great historic campaign like the campaign against apartheid, but we need it against violence. And so I made the motion then in the Central Committee that we have a program against violence. And they passed it. And the next thing that happened was they said, well, you peace churches want to have a program against violence, now tell us what to do. And so, and it came up again in 1998 at another World Council meeting, and they changed it to the Decade to Overcome Violence. And my life during this last decade has been working with international conferences on this Decade to Overcome Violence, and so that's how I got into it.
Neat.
Well, Scott Holland is the one who got me into this Decade to Overcome Violence. I mean, I told you how it developed, but when I retired, Scott is the one that came to me and said to me, he said, we need somebody to lead a conference in Africa on the Decade to Overcome Violence. And you're the man. Will you do it?
No pressure.
I said, well, I'm retired now, and my passion is there. Absolutely, I'll do it. And so we had that conference, and then he and I worked together over the whole decade. And we had 4 international conferences. The conferences were set up in such a way that we brought together members of the historic peace churches, and we said there are 2 questions that we want to ask you. Does being a member of the historic peace church, being a member of a historic peace church, does that make any difference at all in the way you live? And these were people who were already in violent situations, and so in effect it was saying, does it make any difference in the way you respond to the violence you live in day by day? And the second question was, what difference does it make? And so we would spend time listening to the different violent situations that people have been in, and then we would ask them, what difference did it make? And how should the church respond in these kind of situations? And then we kept a recording of all the responses, video and written recording of it. And for each of those conferences then, we developed a book, and I spent all my time editing those books, and those books are available with stories of people around the world who are members of historic peace churches, and the way they've lived and responded to the violence they're in, and they are just really incredible stories.
Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of those types of stories in your new book. Do you want to talk a little bit about your work with that book?
Well, yes. After being in this decade to overcome violence, I was asked by Conrad Reiser, who was the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches during the time that I was in the Central Committee of the World Council. He said, what we need is a booklet, a short booklet that tells some of the stories that illustrate what it means to be for just peace and instead of just war.
Right.
And he said, would you collect some of those stories? I said, yes, I will do it. And so I wrote the booklet, From Just War to Just Peace. And it tells stories to illustrate what it really means to be dedicated to just peace, how one can live for both peace and justice at the same time. And that was given out at the World Council meeting in November that was in South Korea. And there were several hundred of them given out, and I was told by the World Council publisher that there were more of these books given out than of any other book that they gave, except the program guide, of course, which went out to everybody. So the World Council has decided to do a series of books based on the format that's developed here.
Great.
But the whole idea of just peace is that we should be in just war. You're always trying to decide when is the time that the threat or the injustice is so severe that we need to fight.
Right.
So it's always a crisis mentality. You're always on the edge of deciding, should we fight or should we not? And that becomes the focus of everything. Whereas in just peace, the idea is also that we still need justice, but justice is not just an equity or an equivalence of the injury to the punishment.
Right.
But justice is a matter of loving one another. And loving one another means that love your enemy. It means that what we would consider injustice often can best be taken care of not by insisting upon some kind of penalty to the person, but thinking of what really matters to them most and caring for them. That's the heart of what it seems to me the New Testament is about. And so just peace, it's not that all the questions are solved.
Right.
It's just that your whole orientation is for caring for your neighbor and giving your whole self to that. Not just saying, well, that's a nice idea, somebody can do it. No, the church, that ought to be the church's main concern. For living with and loving, caring for our neighbors in such a way that their lives are enhanced as Jesus intended. Now, Jesus lived that way and he got crucified.
Right.
So you can't say that everything will be really nice if you live that way. But what you can say is the world will be a different place.
Absolutely.
And now, what about you? How does this fit your vision?
Yeah, I can see. The way I kind of understand it is that justice and peace need to be wedded together. When you have justice by itself, you kind of get black and white laws about, if you do this, then this will happen. It becomes something that is beyond individuals and looking at circumstance. And when peace is by itself, it's always something that, not always, but it can become something where we don't deal with problems for the sake of a sense of peace, that we brush problems under the rug, I think about this in terms when I've had conversations with people about my understanding of being a pacifist. There's a sense that that means I'm not going to deal with conflict, I'm going to avoid conflict. And that's when, for me, it's important that justice and peace be wedded together. It allows for people to understand context and to look at people rather than look at issues. Mm-hmm. And that we're dealing with both proactively and reactively looking at how things can be both fair and looking at the reality of people in the situation. I think sometimes it's hard for people to relate to just peace when they're so set on having a defined answer for every problem, mm-hmm. And in a way that that totally neglects the reality of the complexity of situations. It's easy for, I think, a lot of people to resort to war and to violence because it is a set response. That's probably a lot easier, but it's a lot less creative. And just peace requires a certain sense of creativity and living into complexity. Mm-hmm. That because people aren't black and white, mm-hmm. that people are not always going to be the same, that situations are not always going to be the same, so we can't say going in that this is always going to be how we're going to respond to violence. And then it becomes very important that the people that are directly involved are the ones that are voicing what needs to happen. That we don't, we're not police of the nation, we're not police of the world, and that we are directly relating to the people that are actually involved in the problem, and let them be the people mm-hmm. then that are figuring out what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's justice by itself and peace by itself can be a problem, but when they're wed together, that's when true responses to violence mm-hmm. can be effective.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying. I think that is so good. One of the things that I'm convinced about is that if we are to be peaceful as Jesus was, then we should have the same attitude toward other people and other religions and other traditions that Jesus did. Mm-hmm. And so when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest law? And his answer was, love your neighbor as yourself. And then they asked, who is your neighbor? Now, he didn't choose the most religious or the foremost person of his church. We have to think of it the way he would have. It was in the Jewish tradition. Mm-hmm. He didn't pick somebody who was Jewish and who was well known to answer that question. No, in fact, all of the religious people went mm-hmm. around the person who was waylaid on the road, and but what he chose was somebody who they would have considered to be an atheist at the time, mm-hmm. to be in our terminology, to be a non-Christian. Right. And he used the non-Christian, quote non-Christian, because that's equivalent to the way he was speaking. Mm-hmm. He chose the non-Christian to illustrate what it means to love your neighbors right. yourself. And when for example, he went to Nazareth and gave his first sermon, he stood up, and everybody, well, no, I guess he sat down. You sit down when you're giving. In that tradition, you don't stand up. You sit down. Okay, he sat down then, whatever. And he began to speak, and he talked about the king of Babylon mm-hmm. could be the messenger of God's will mm-hmm. for Israel. Nobody like that. Yeah. Nobody like that. Uh-huh. And he talked about the prophet who healed the person of leprosy mm-hmm. who was not Jewish mm-hmm. had gone to do that, and they didn't like that either. Mm-hmm. He was suggesting that we should have that kind of attitude toward other people. Right. And much of his Much of his ministry was like that.
Mm-hmm.
He went into the Decapolis, which was outside of Israel, and he healed the man who was in the tomb, who was caught, who had this the spirit that made him, just really out of his mind, and Jesus healed him. But in healing him, he sent the spirit into the pigs, and all the pigs went rushing down into the water and where they were drowned. And the people said, "Get out of here! We don't want you. The pigs are worth more than somebody who's lost his mind, who's caught with a spirit like that." They said, "Away from here." But Jesus had that kind of attitude, and if we're going to be like Jesus, then we need a similar attitude to that. And that means being open to other traditions and seeing God act in other traditions. And that's so needed, because I think you could say almost all the wars in our day come because people have religious commitments that their way is right. It's God's only way, and we're fighting this in God's name. I do not think that's appropriate to what the New Testament Jesus is about. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean the commandment, the greatest commandment, Jesus' response is, love the Lord your God, reflecting back to Deuteronomy, and then saying, love your neighbor. And to me, that's been a really important message of peace for me in the New Testament, because love of God and love of neighbor are unavoidably bound together. That when we love our neighbor, especially in those harder times, that it is a way of worshiping God. Peace with our neighbor is worship. And that's been a very important thing for me to remember when I've looked at what it means for me to be a faithful Christian. Those two things are unavoidably bound together.
Well, one of the stories, in fact, it's one of the stories in the book here, that I have many stories to illustrate what it means to be just peaceful. One that just blows my mind. I mean, every time, this is not my story. This is the story that people told when we had these international conventions. And this was in Indonesia. And the Mennonite church was thinking how they could relate to what they knew was a really a terrorist group that was killing people in Indonesia, and they were a Hezbollah group, and so they decided, well, the way to do that was to have one of their pastors, go and become a member of the group. A member of a Hezbollah group? I mean, for heaven's sake. I mean, isn't the better way to do this to send the police in, find out where the group is, and go in with arrest them, Isn't, my gracious, isn't that the better way to do it? Well, anyhow, so the pastor went to the Hezbollah group and made himself known, and when the commander came to the door, he said, "Who are you and what do you want?" He said, "I want to join your group." He said, "You're a Mennonite pastor. I know that. You're a Mennonite pastor. Why do you want to join our group?" He said, "I want to join it. Can I join or not?" And he said, "You're an unbeliever. That means we can kill you at any moment for any reason, on any occasion." The pastor said, "Can I join or not?" He said, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" He said, "Do you understand that?" He said, "Yes." The pastor said, "Yes. Can I join?" He said, "All right, as long as you understand." And so he joined the group. Now, it's a long story, and just to say, I'd love to tell you the whole story, but it's very long. the thing is that he was able to work with his group. The members of the group were all people, young people without jobs. They had there was no hope in their lives. The one thing they felt like they could do that was any significance to be a part of this historic event, which they felt was working against things that the Western forces that were keeping them all economically depressed and giving them no opportunities in their life. And but he started working with them. He helped them to find jobs. He worked with them in terms of they would have fights and arguments with each other. He helped them to resolve those kind of things. He soon became co-commander in the group.
Wow.
By soon, it took 4 or 5 years, but he did. And finally, they were working to work with people who had been caught in the tsunami, and all the people that had lost their homes and their property and their relatives and their families, you know. And so the pastor had his Mennonite young people with him, and the commander had his group of young people, and the commander looked at the pastor and said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "You've done this now all these years." He said, we consider you one of our own. Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves." And he said, he said, Jesus taught us to love our enemies. That's the way I want to put it. Jesus taught us to love our enemies. And he said, "You're an enemy of mine. I'm an enemy of yours." We're asked to love one another. And the commander said, "I don't know any Christian who believes that." He said, "If that's the way Jesus really is, I want to live like that." Now, to me, I mean, okay, you can say that can't happen. You couldn't do that with a Hitler. In fact, if we had had that attitude at the end of World War I, World War II wouldn't have happened.
True.
Because Hitler was treated, I mean, he was treated with just war principles. I mean, justice, which meant that Germany had to grovel and pay the price for causing World War I. And no, if we'd had a different view about that, World War II wouldn't have happened the way it did. Now, it does. My gracious, it doesn't solve all the problems, but it shows what enormous possibilities, and where should the church be in this discussion?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we forget that peace has power. I think so often we think about it as being passive. And when you hear stories like that, you remember that peace has power. You look at Christ, who was the Prince of Peace, and how much power he had in that, and in the power of love.
Yeah. I just saw today. I was just reading that in the countries where dictatorial governments have been overcome and moved in the direction of democracy, that hardly any can be found where that was done by military direction, by military overcoming. They happen because of nonviolent protests that develop among the people there themselves and are supported from the outside. And that's what happened in South Africa, the way I was telling you about it. And that if we look for those possibilities, instead of looking for what military means will we use to solve this problem, what a difference it would make.
Right.
And who should take the leadership in seeing it that way? It looks like the church ought to, because that's what we claim to be.
Right.